then we have these level 1, 2, and 3. These are a little bit more specialized, more in-depth. Ambassador training also is available on our website. It's a couple hours long, and it's really aimed for those people that are interested in now taking that message further into their community, participating in presentation, really doing a lot of outreach work. So that's where they can get a lot of training on how to do that. And the other two are more specific programming that we have. Also, we just launched an all course for insurance professionals. They can actually get credits, professional development credits. They complete that course, and it's online, it's free of charge, but it is very much targeted at the insurance industry, which we know has a significant stake in this field. And then landscaping, there's another one. Landscaping professionals play a very important role in educating their clients when they're putting together landscaping plans, and they make sure that they're not recommending designs or landscapes that actually would elevate the risk of emissions versus reducing the risk. So it's an important industry that needs to be familiar with FireSmart best practices. And then Ryan and I are actively right now working on a course at municipal planners and local government staff to really educate them on the things that they can be thinking about and taking into account when working with new developments or rebuild planning and that type of stuff. So very important area of our focus, as well as addressing builders and developers. So a lot of training that's available right now. We're also just in the process of building out what we're calling a training network. This is going to be a cadre of qualified instructors that we will have available across the country. So when different communities want to integrate or implement, I should say, programming in the training sectors or familiarity with the wildfire protection plans, they can rely on that trainer network to come in and help them get that started. In terms of programs, we have a number of programs available. Some of them are currently implemented nationally, like the Neighborhood Recognition Program on Wildfire Preparedness Day. Other ones are still in development, like the Development Recognition Program, where it's just at that pilot stage on that one. The FireSmart Begins at Mass is also available nationally, and I highly urge everyone on this call to take advantage of it. It's essentially an app. There's no cost to use it. Available for iOS or Android devices, and it's essentially a self-assessment tool that you use to assess your own properties with other friends and neighbors. So it's a really great way to start your journey when it comes to risk reduction. And then in these last two, the Advanced Home Assessment Program and the Home Partnership Program are essentially two programs that are very specific to doing home assessment, and they require trained assessors. So those are all not necessarily available everywhere yet, but as we build out having more trained assessors, that will become a very great way to educate the public on what they should be doing to reduce their risk. So a number of programs there. And of course, that a lot of education materials are all available on our website. You can download as PDFs. Many of our agent partners have printed versions of these that you can make available to communities, whether it's posters, guides, or fact sheets. All that is available. We also have some resources for children and associations and communities allows us. So all that's available on our website. And then FireSmart partnerships. Like I mentioned, this is a full-side type of lens that we look through and that we need to partner with. We do have what's called the FireSmart advisory team, which made up non-government agencies. Some are private industry, others are civilians, various kinds. And ultimately, the aim there is to really bring together various stakeholders and subject matter experts to identify the best ways to tackle this issue and increase resilience across the country. Now I'll hand it over to Ryan, who will walk you through some more detail around how is it that how do we look at doing assessment and what to talk to people about the future. So I'll hand that over to
you. So the big issue right now is not just that we have wildfire, which will always have wildfire, it's changing threat. And how wildfires are becoming more prevalent, more intense, larger in size, and threatening more of our wildland urban interface, that area of communities where the built environment and the natural environment are interconnected and it's expanding. The amount of areas that are needed is wildland urban interface and because the settlements are expanding more and more into wildland every year, and that's primarily because of how our communities grow. Development typically happens at the fringes of communities, not necessarily in individual style development within cities. A lot of what we're seeing in communities around the country is fall into previously undeveloped areas. Typically, these are forests and grass and as our communities grow, the amount of area and the amount of river that is directly interconnected with wildland growth. As more property and infrastructure is created as these fringes of our communities and that wildland is growing, more of those properties and more infrastructure are exposed to wildfire, which is increasing the risk of wildfire, both in terms of the occurrence of fire and also the risk that wildfire poses to those structures or areas in the wilderness. This is happening because development has an impact on climate change and the part of climate change having an impact on how it's all built and wildfire in general. Mitigation is the sort of spread of bright conditions behind this. It's creating longer fire seasons, hotter weather that we're experiencing more frequently, also creating longer fire seasons and more dangerous conditions. The two primary triggers we need for a wildfire risk greater is repetition or longer fire conditions. refrigeration, which is the burning of in the medium term, people are typically when the wildfire is approaching the population of the area is kind of the area. There isn't like often a population can't enter the area right away. When you term population, depending on the severity of the burn, some populations have there's an example of that, like where there was such a large that the population typically hasn't back because it essentially reconstruction. The issue with that is the economic impact long term. You have a population that have a special skill set that don't return because they've lost something. And in my mind, they sort of recreate a life somewhere else and maybe go social. The challenge is that long term we have to diminish capacity in that community. So the immediate term is that immediate level construction, and medium term is like people, and then long term is social that community reform as a community and we can integrate. There are factors that are influencing that wildfire in communities. Really depends on the landscape, what's around there, and whether we can so there's three primary factors that get influenced by the wildfire, and that's the landscape, the topography, and as I mentioned before, really what really surges the extreme wildfire, on weather size, the drought conditions, and also the temperature and precipitation relative to the community, and really create conditions for fire to grow quickly. In terms of landscape fire, rises are also like hills, and in terms of vegetation, forest trees that red readily. The more of those that are involved in the area, the more that these trees transmit fire, rock and the fuels that you do if that's greater areas, they create a huge impact on structures and everybody as wildland fire extreme heat and direct light. The number one way that homes ignite is through embers and sparks. As the wildland burns, particularly some of those oily trees that like conifers, like pines and spruce, they release a lot of embers once the foliage is up of the tree, or we call the crown. Once the crown ignites, they produce a lot of embers high up in the air, and those embers can travel up to 2 kilometers. What they do is they blow ahead of the fire, and often will start smaller spot fires that spread the fire faster, but those also will land on structures. If the structures are not protected properly, then those homes can catch fire, and those homes are full of a very different kind of fuel, not a natural fuel. They're an artificial fuel. And in some of those cases, those fuels burn a lot hotter, and they burn
and they'll create a lot more embers, and they threaten the homes around them. So then the next way, you have homes catching fires through extreme heat. If some of those fuel sources are too close, whether it's a natural fuel source like a tree or an artificial fuel source nearby that has caught fire, or direct flame if there are things like wood piles stacked right beside the house, where these embers and sparks land and ignite a wood pile or a deck or a tree or a shrub at the base of the home, and then that direct flame can ignite the home itself. So the core principle of FireSmart is really that if homes don't ignite, then the homes don't burn. So getting into what the wildland-urban interface is. So the wildland-urban interface is that space, as we've talked about, where the wildland and the urban meet. So there's a continuum here that you can see that helps to understand and identify what we're speaking about specifically when we're talking about the wildland-urban interface. And that's really the middle part. It's where we see significant homes and properties being developed, but there's still being a high level of natural fuels involved in places. I'm sure everyone can think of some, especially around the Toronto area, where these suburbs exist, where we have fairly low density properties being developed within the natural heritage features, within trees, within shrubs. There's a lot of natural fuels around. The key factor in wildland-urban interface fires is the fuel mix. There's a reason why it's a big issue, and it's because there's natural fires from the woods and the wildland, and these artificial fuels from the urban features, the homes and the cars and everything else in that area. The tricky part is that you have to fight fires, natural fires and artificial fires differently, depending on what the fuel is and what's burning. So they require a different response. So typically we would have structural firefighters fighting house fires and wildland firefighters fighting wildland fires. And when you end up in a situation where there is natural fuels and artificial fuels, and some of them require different treatment, whether it's foaming agents or water, depending on what's burning, you end up with a difficult emergency to manage. So what ends up happening is the wildland-urban interface disaster sequence, or the WUI disaster sequence. Now, this is a model of how wildland fire transmits into urban centers and becomes a disaster scenario. It starts with severe fire conditions, that fire weather, that drought and the wind and the hot heat and humidity being low, and you have fuel and you have the weather and the topography that creates fire conditions to start a wildland fire. As the wildland fire spreads and grows, it moves into urban areas. Now, these urban areas is typically first encountered in the wildland-urban interface. Most cities have these low-density suburban sprawl neighborhoods where they move into the wildland. So you have a lot of frontage of properties that interface directly with natural areas. So these natural fires move in through those areas and become urban fires. This is when the wildland fire has spread into homes, ignited them, and they have become urban fires, and you have ignitions in that urban area. What quickly happens is, as multiple homes ignite, you have overwhelmed fire suppression resources. We only have so many firefighters to fight so many fires. So as firefighters are fighting one home, if there's a second home, perhaps they can handle 2 homes. But at 3 homes, maybe it's challenging to fight that fire. And by the time 4 or 5 homes are igniting, there's only so many fires that the firefighters we have can fight. So then we have reduced fire protection. The more firefighters are involved in actively combating flames in homes, the less fire protection we can offer to other homes in that area as the spot fires spread and move, and as the wildfire moves through that urban area. And then we start losing structures. And after numerous homes have been destroyed by the fire, we have what we would call a disaster. How FireSmart works and how we break this sequence is by stopping the transmission of wildland fire into urban fire areas. And how we do that is through our FireSmart practices. So the severe fire conditions still happen at this time. We don't control the climate as much as I'm sure we'd like to. We still have natural ignition like lightning strikes starting wildland fires. We're still going to have wildland fires spread. It's not about eliminating the wildland fire. It's about preventing and mitigating the spread of wildland fire into urban areas. And we do that by protecting the properties and protecting the home with resilience measures. So breaking that sequence and using those resilience measures and resilience strategies looks like our home ignition zone from FireSmart. So the home ignition zone is built on an idea of 3 zones. So we have the immediate zone, which is the first 0 to 1.5 meters from the house. Then we have the intermediate zone from 1.5 meters to 10 meters from the house. And then we have the extended zone, which is 10 meters to 30 meters from the structure, from the house. And then we have a beyond zone, which is beyond 30 meters, which essentially follows the same instructions as the extended zone. The immediate zone, the primary purpose of the immediate zone is non-combustibility, which means the materials in that area should be materials that don't catch fire. Strategies in that can be things like if you have bark mulch around the base of the home or in plantings and gardens, that bark mulch can be swapped out for a non-combustible alternative. You can use things like river rock or stone in this area to really reduce the combustibility of the materials in there. The plant choices that you make for being in that area are extremely important. And there's been studies that have shown that improving just the immediate zone of the home to a non-combustible standard will reduce the ignition potential of the home by up to 40%. The immediate zone and it is all about reducing fire transmission and improving resistance to wildfire selectively. And the actions you take in this zone are thinning trees and pruning trees and trying to keep the combustibility of this zone to a minimum. If you have furniture in this space, like outdoor furniture, maybe it's not combustible, or maybe you move it further away from the home. In the extended zone, you're really worried about minimizing spread and ember generation. So that is selecting the right trees, pruning them, and making sure that they're spaced adequately apart so that the trees do not transmit fire from one tree to another. Magda, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And I just wanted to add a couple quick points to this specific slide, because it is something that's basically foundational to everything that we talk about within FireSmart, and all the programming revolves around it. But what I wanted to do is just tie back to something that Ryan talked about earlier, which is the 3 ways that fire impacts structures. So this slide here, which we talked about embers, extreme heat, and direct flame, is essentially what we base this home ignition zone concept on. The point being that through research and a lot of evidence that we've gathered, and not just us, but many researchers, the direct flame within 10 meters of the home will not impact the home. the extreme heat within 20 or 10 meters of the home will not impact the home. But it would with depending on which zone it reaches up to. So the immediate zone really is impacted predominantly by ember transport and accumulation. So what Ryan mentioned earlier is that ember tend to travel quite a long distance ahead of a fire front, and then they will drop down and accumulate in certain spots. Imagine if you were thinking about, say, a snowstorm, or maybe there's a windstorm and you've got leaves that are kind of accumulating around your foundation in nooks and crannies, under the deck, in your gutters. That's where embers will accumulate. So if they're accumulating on combustible materials, whether it's, you've got a wooden roof, or you've got that bark mulch that Ryan mentioned, or you've got a bunch of cedars or junipers or whatnot planted right around your home, that's where those embers accumulate and ignite those specific items, which then ignite other things. And that heat that might have been at the 20-meter mark or the 30-meter mark is now right at your foundation. And then further materials start to ignite hotter, longer, and then it becomes a structural fire. So I just wanted to link those three types of how fire transmits into a structural fire, and link them to this home ignition zone, because these zones are really specifically designed on that concept.
Thank you. So moving on into the next part of this discussion around the home ignition zone, protecting the home from the embers and sparks, the direct flame and the radiant heat, is reducing ignition potential, which is really the goal of the program. And it's the interesting part of it is reducing ignition potential. A lot of the actions that you would take on a property are low cost and low effort interventions. And they are the ones that drive the largest returns in terms of reducing your overall ignition potential. So activities that you can take on a property, like moving ignitable materials away from the house, like firewood or wooden patio furniture, or replanting shrubs like the juniper and the cedars that are currently against the base of your house, moving them out into the extended zone or eliminating them. A lot of the actions that you can take that drive the largest returns in terms of reducing your ignition potential risk come from those low cost, low effort actions. There are some other actions that you can take, like replacing a roof or replacing siding or changing the material of the decking on a deck. And these are higher cost, and they also have returns in terms of risk reduction with them. And there is a point at which you have invested in a lot of the structural protection actions you can take in reducing risk, and further investment starts to deliver smaller returns in terms of risk reduction. So the key takeaway is that a lot of these actions you can take are low cost and low effort to really drive a reduced wildfire transmission risk around your structure. So the actions that individuals can take are those that you would find in our training, and you can take the training, the free training online. That's probably the best place to start. You can use the Begins at Home guide that we offer to evaluate your property and find out the areas and the actions that you can take on your property to make your home and your structures more wildfire resilient. You can become an advocate or a champion for wildfire resilience in your community, and you can assess your structure using a self-assessment to evaluate the preparedness of your property. And we're going to do that here really quickly with these two images. This house that I've taken an image of from Google Street View. So the self-assessment guide really covers actions that you can take in the immediate, intermediate, and extended zones. And we're just going to look at a few of them here. So the first part of the immediate zone asks, does this structure have acceptable fire-rated roofing material? This is a wooden roof. That's if a ember lands on this or if embers accumulate on this, there's a strong potential for this roof to ignite. That's not an acceptable fire-rated roofing material. Are the roof and gutters non-combustible and are they clear of debris? Well, it's difficult to tell, but judging by the debris on the roof, I would say that potentially there's some debris in the gutters, or at least there's still debris on the roof. And the debris on the roof, if it's dry, it's another bed for embers to land and ignite. We go over exterior siding. Is the exterior siding non-combustible or ignition resistant? This looks like a stucco sided structure, although up in the upper gable above the doorway, there's some wood exposed siding. So that's not ideal, but the stucco below is certainly an ignition resistant siding. Is the siding free of gaps? Are the windows multi-pane? Are doors non-combustible? Are exterior walls protected with a minimum of 15 centimeters vertical clearance? There's all kinds of different steps to the self-assessment that lets you evaluate whether or not your structure is protected or your risk from fire expanding into your home has been reduced. So as you move further out, is the lawn cut to a length of 10 centimeters or less? Is the yard free of combustible debris? And what's your landscaping and your garden beds look like? Where are the conifer trees and how are they spaced? Looking at this property, some of the lawn looks like it's short, some of the lawn looks like it's more. And then we look at the street that it's on, and we see some other homes, and maybe they have vinyl siding. Maybe there's some longer grass and some shrubs. And then we look in the other direction, and we see some wooden fencing down the street and some big trees, some conifers. This was taken in 2023, and there was a wildfire disaster in this area. And the next slide is going to show that destruction. So just so everybody is prepared for that. So the next slide is 2025. This is Jasper, Alberta, after the fires and after a lot of the debris removal has happened. This is the same position on the street, looking down the same street as the first image, and the second image that I've just put up is looking down the street in the other direction. I don't know if the slide has changed yet, but I don't know how to make it change. There we go. That's looking down in the other direction. So what was a full neighborhood of homes was lost to a wildfire that started outside the city in the wildland and rapidly spread to the town site and ignited homes. And once it was in there, it overwhelmed suppression resources despite their best efforts and despite them really, really trying. And it's because there were a lot of combustible homes and a lot of places for embers to land, and it just overwhelmed the resources, and we have that disaster situation.
And I'll just to reinforce in this example that Ryan's using, the wildfire, the flame front never entered the community. This was entirely caused by embers entering the community, accumulating in these properties, igniting the homes. They were a high density community, so then it was a structure to structure conflagration. So when we talk about embers, this is really the key impact that we see when it comes to wildfire impacts on communities. And based on the many catastrophic wildfires we've seen in research, up to 90% of the homes that are damaged due to wildfire are damaged because of ember impact. So this is an incredible example of that. where we saw the homes, we saw what was on those properties, what they're built with. In Jasper, there were still numerous homes with wood roofing, which was probably the worst thing to have for when it comes to wildfire impacts. And then, as Ryan mentioned earlier, those structures then burn hotter and they burn longer, and they're close together, so that structure to structure ignition then happens pretty quickly.
Exactly. And so to address that, how do I move to the next? There we go. And to address that, we have worked with the municipality of Jasper and Parks Canada to create their rebuilding guide. And out of that, we've also created our FireSmart residential development guide. And these two pieces of information, along with foundational concepts such as the home ignition zone and many other of our materials, like our landscaping guide and training, have contributed to creating measures and new bylaws in places like Jasper, so that the reconstruction efforts are directed in such a way that the homes being rebuilt are from the start resistant and resilient to wildfire. So we don't have places for embers to build and then that they could ignite materials, and we have that non-combustible immediate zone, and we're making sure that the redevelopment that happens is going to be a built back better concept. Back to Magda for the broader action.
Thanks, Ryan. So the other piece to community resilience is looking at a big picture. And so taking some broader action, which, when we talk about the FireSmart disciplines, one of them is interagency cooperation. And it's building a community wildfire protection plan that is at that municipal or town level. It engages the many stakeholders that have a role to play in ensuring that that community is protected. And that would include everything from emergency planning and management to response capabilities to evacuation planning, the rebuild efforts, recovery, and more importantly for us, it's the planning ahead and identifying where and what kind of resiliency measures the community should be taking and implementing to reduce that risk from the get-go. So does that mean vegetation management in and around the community? Does it include home assessments and neighborhood activities? And what kind of funding is needed to even make this happen? So community wildfire protection plans are a critical starting point to really have a good plan of where to go next and where some of those gaps may be. In British Columbia, these are called community wildfire resiliency plans. I think Newfoundland is calling them that as well. So there's a couple different names that are floating around, but ultimately every province and territory are looking at ways to have these available and created for the communities in their jurisdictions. And we're currently rolling out a template for the provinces and territories that may not be as active with CWPPs, as we call them. And we are drawing close to the end here, but in terms of, I saw there was a couple questions there. The Begins at Home app was a question somebody had. That's the name of it. Begins at Home app is that, what am I trying to say? Mobile app is what I'm trying to say, that people can download and use to do a self-evaluation of their properties. There's also a print version, which Ryan showed on one of the slides. It's kind of hidden inside our Begins at Home guide, but it's also a standalone document on our website. We also have what are called FireSmart liaisons across the country. So every province and territory has their own liaison that works within the wildfire agency for that province or territory. The list and contact information is on our website under Contact Us. And there you will find, so if you reside in Ontario, you can find the Ontario liaison, or if you reside in Newfoundland, you'll find the liaison for that particular province. And that's who you can reach out to if you want to do some more work within your community, and they will support you. So I did see a question in that Q&A list of, you know, I work with the Scouts, or I have a youth program. How can I get someone to come and present? Reach out to your local liaison for your province or territory and ask them for assistance. They are accountable for those kinds of supports, and they can also provide you with materials. Furthermore, each one of our agency partners now has access to our Ember, the FireSmart Fox mascot. So if you want to do an event in your college or in your community center, you may be able to get them to come out with the mascot as well. You may have seen this, I'm not sure, but this is a national campaign that we ran last year, and we plan on running it again this year with some refreshed visuals. The Please Don't Feed the Wildfires campaign ran on many social platforms and TV platforms, and we also had billboards. And it's essentially reinforcing that you know, there are things that we can do and take control over. Get FireSmart, and please don't feed the wildfires. And I think it's time for questions, if you have any.
Awesome. Thank you, Magda, Ryan, for that informative and well thought out presentation. And thanks again for going over what FireSmart Canada is doing in terms of providing material training out there. It's truly amazing the kind of work that you and your team is doing just in the realm of education, because that is the tipping point and that's the trend that I've been seeing. And I'm really befuddled by the amount of impact an Amber can create. So thank you so much educating us on that. So yeah, moving on to Q&A, I do recognize that you have answered some of these questions, but if you haven't already submitted your questions, a reminder that you can do so through the Q&A tab. And the first question that I see here is, do you work with Indigenous elders for monitored burns as well?
Do you want me to answer that, Magda, or do you want to?
Go ahead.
So we work through partners for most things. So while we may not work directly with Indigenous communities for monitored burns, we do have partners that do work with Indigenous communities on prescribed burning. And some areas like that are, the University of British Columbia has a research program around prescribed burns. We communicate with the Canadian Prairies Fire Exchange, which does prescribed and cultural burning practices in Mawasson, and that's out in Saskatchewan. We do have some information and access to the cultural and prescribed burning that's done by First Nations. And in some situations, we perhaps speak with them and work with them directly, but mostly the work is done through partnerships. Is that, Magda, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. Ultimately, the partnerships are between the wildfire agencies, the provincial and territorial wildfire agencies, and whatever community or organization that they're working with. So that tends to be done at that provincial and territorial level with their partners. We don't get directly involved in any planning or prescribed fire work, but we are working on some resource materials just in terms of educational types of materials to make available to people.
All right. Thank you. There's one other question around, are there local programs and incentives that support FireSmart upgrades?
Magda?
So that one. So a couple of things I didn't get into a lot of detail on the Wildfire Preparedness Day and the Neighborhood Recognition Program. But in both of those, we do provide some funding for taking actions within the community. So they're very small amounts, but it just helps to offset potentially some costs related to running a cleanup event in your community or some kind of outreach activities and such. So those are usually applied to through our website. There's a specific period of time when that application window is open, and they're specifically related to that Wildfire Community Preparedness Day or Neighborhood Recognition Program. Aside from that, there are a number of funding programs that exist. There's a little bit I'll call ad hoc, and they may vary from province to province. In British Columbia, there is a more robust, I'll say, funding model where communities can tap into rebate programs, but they must have a community wildfire protection plan in place, and they must have a program coordinator on staff to kind of coordinate the programming. So there's certain criteria that need to be met. And then there's some insurance companies now that are running various grants that communities can apply for. The Wawanisa Wildfire Prevention Grant is one of those, and then Intact also has a larger amount. I think they can, their grant is up to $200,000. So it's quite significant. And then the Federation for Canadian Municipalities has what's called a Green Fund, and that also can provide some financial assistance to communities, primarily municipalities, when they're working on resiliency measures. So there's a number of different methods to access funding, and sometimes they're not necessarily consistent from province to province.
All right. Thank you, Magda. Next question, I think so. This one is for Ryan. They say, love the self-assessment houses, and I really wonder what strategies can represent or shape housing codes for fire resilient homes, and how FireSmart helps support those strategies.
So the self-assessment is really something that the homeowner can do for themselves, and it's something that anyone anywhere in this country can do. In some provinces, there are advanced home assessors and people that can come out and perform assessments on your house, but anyone can do a self-assessment through a downloadable PDF guide that's available on our website. So you can download it, you can print it, and you can go through this self-assessment. The strategies that help shape building codes and for fire resilient homes, well, some of them are in the works already. The Canadian Standards Council is in the process of adopting what's called the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires, which is a document that's very code-like that has been developed by the National Research Council, and the Canadian Standards Council is in the middle of working that into a standard, which can eventually be adopted into the National Building Code or the National Model Code. Really, FireSmart is built on the same research and the same data that created the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires. So a lot of the data that created the FireSmart program and the self-assessment and everything like that is already working to help shape building codes for homes at the national level. But then there's an additional step of provinces, because they're the constitutional authority for private homes and infrastructure and private property. They're the ones that have to then adopt those practices from the National Model Code into their provincial level codes. So that's really what's happening now.
All right, thank you, Ryan. There's one other question I think so you will be able to address. Do you see emerging technologies like AI, satellite monitoring, or drones being integrated into FireSmart programs to help these communities identify wildfire risks early on, or just monitor vegetation conditions in general?
They already are. Perhaps not in Canada, but in some places in Canada, certainly there's remote monitoring, both as satellites, which there was just a satellite launched recently that's specifically for wildfire monitoring, if I remember correctly, for Canada. But drones and AI and cameras and smoke detection through remote cameras and things like that are already being developed and already in use. How they would influence the FireSmart program is tricky. I think there's pretty limited application, except for perhaps some AI application in terms of running through maybe a building assessment or something, or using drones for inspection. But they definitely have a role. That all that tech has a role to play in terms of wildfire resilience and planning.
All right, thank you. Next one, I think so this is for you, Magda. What are the obstacles that prevent people from being educated in the wildfire risk reduction side of the program? So it's a very unique question, but it's a very plausible given today's day and age.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. Adoption or engagement by the general public is really critical for the success of FireSmart programming. But at the same time, that is a big challenge, because we do see a lot of folks take on that attitude, oh, well, it won't happen to me, or, oh, I live in an area that doesn't have wildfire, so I don't have to worry about it. And that may be true, but what we're seeing is, with the changing climate and a lot of fuel accumulation over time, there are areas that are prime for wildfire that may have not historically had a lot of wildfire. And so we are trying to come up with ways to really engage with those folks and those communities to help them realize that you can't wait, you can't assume, you can't just think, oh, well, the fire department's going to save my house when the time comes. That preparing and planning is integral, and it's something you need to do early. So really helping people understand how is it that wildfires actually impact communities usually helps sort of change, or, well, either change people's thought process around that fact that they can take some actions, and just makes it a little bit more realistic for them that they can actually do something. But yeah, ultimately it's behavioral science, right? It's figuring out how do you convince people to prepare for something that may or may not happen. And so breaking it down into small digestible actions, and like what Ryan mentioned earlier, taking maybe some of those low cost actions that you may be doing already, whether it's spring cleaning and making sure that your property is well maintained. Those are all actions that people are already taking. Now let's just help them understand that that also helps with wildfire risk reduction. I don't know if I answered.
Perfect. Thank you. No, fair enough. We had someone wanting to see if we were able to discuss the worksheet, just so that they are able to recall all the information that was discussed. So we have a few minutes, like a couple of minutes. If Magda, Ryan, if you guys are able to go over the questions and just discuss the answers, and be easier for our audience members.
Sure, yeah, I see the worksheet here in our chat, so that's helpful. So the first question I see here is, what is one way that FireSmart works to address wildfire? So this was covered on slide 3. No, our slide 3. So here we have our disciplines. Education is one key way of addressing wildfire in terms of making sure people understand how it impacts their community, how it is that the embers are really the key factor in homes catching fire, and what are those actions that then people can take. So it's a combination, I guess. It's not one thing necessarily. You know, education is that one thing, but ultimately understanding that, oh, embers are really the key factor in communities being impacted by wildfire. And if I remove those combustible materials, well, I then break that wildfire disaster sequence, because there's no way for those embers to then ignite anything on my property. So I would say that is the first one here. What is the cost to take FireSmart Level 1 Ambassador training? So we did cover that. I'm not sure. Are you wanting me to just answer all these questions for everybody? Or are we having a conversation? Not sure how you'd like us to handle this.
Yeah, just conversations are fine. I'm sure everyone is able to capture as much information. So so yeah, you can just summarize the question, just go over what was covered, and then it'll be easier for them to fill this up. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the training, I mentioned there's FireSmart 101 and Level 1 Ambassador training, both available on our website. Both available to anybody that's interested. It doesn't matter if you have any wildfire background or not. This is meant to educate the general public, and those are at no cost, and they're self-paced online courses. At the end, there's a quiz, and you would then get a downloadable certificate of completion. So I highly encourage everybody to look into that. Now I'll hand over this to Ryan, but what are the 3 ways that homes ignite due to wildfire?
Ember and sparks, radiant heat, direct flame.
Short and sweet, get to the point, absolutely.
Yeah, those are the 3 ways that homes ignite. There's not a whole lot of discussion there. We know how the embers and sparks are generated. They are carried on the wind during a wildfire event, and they land on the home, and they ignite materials that they land on or in. Extreme heat is an effect of having things too close to the home that burn very hot, and direct flame is the result of having things way too close to the home that like to burn. Moving on to the 4th one, that wildland urban interface fires are particularly difficult to fight because of the mix of artificial and natural fuel types. True or false? It's true. That's the reason they are particularly difficult to fight, because there is a mixture of both natural and artificial fuel types. And then the 3 zones of the home ignition zone are on that graphic. And I hope people wrote those down. But they are the core concept of all of FireSmart. And it is that there's the immediate zone close to the home, the intermediate zone slightly further out, and then the extended zone further out beyond that. And the resources for FireSmart can be found at firesmartcanada.ca. As with everything else for the FireSmart program, the neighborhood recognition program and any of those links, firesmartcanada.ca is the website for the national program, and everything you need FireSmart is on that page.
All right. Thank you very much to our audience for submitting your questions, and to Magda and Ryan being very patient and diligent. Thank you so much for responding to those questions. We would appreciate hearing your feedback and thoughts on this session, which can be shared through the survey that you will receive on your screen once you leave the session. It is quite valuable for us so that we continue to improve our symposium for next year. Our next session is with Chris Turner at 1:30 EST. Make sure that you join and get inspired about future focus talk, which draws around 2 decades of experience that Chris Turner has in reporting on global climate solutions. If you haven't registered yet, there is still time. Visit our website, and we hope to see you all there. Lastly, we would like to invite you to join us for an in-person sustainability networking event, which is happening on Thursday, which is the day after, at 4 p.m. at our Newnham residence in Toronto. This gathering will bring together students, staff, faculty, and community members who are passionate about building a greener future. We will have TD and Eco Canada in the panel. They'll be discussing about the green sector in general and the potential opportunities to work in this sector. So this is all we have for now. Thank you so much, and see you guys in the next one.